Let me know when to start, okay? All right.
Wait. It's on.
So, start the meeting. Or the live streaming. Good morning or afternoon, depends on where you are. Shall we begin? Right. Dear speakers, guests, attendees, and friends, I would like to welcome you to our meeting today, where I have the honor to be the moderator. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Josh. I'm originally from Jakarta, Indonesia, but I've also lived in Singapore for a couple of years before finally settling here in Bonn, Germany. I'm currently pursuing my bachelor's degree in political science and economics, majoring in international relations. And we also have two other speakers who will share their knowledge with us today. Our first speaker is Professor Michael W. Charney. An honor to have you here with us, Professor Charney.
Thank you for having me.
And our second speaker is Dr. Karen. Also an honor to have you with us today, Dr. Karen.
Thank you for having me too.
So before we begin with the presentation, I would like to give some time for Reza Kasbullah and Andy. Reza as the president of PPI Jerman and Andy as the president of AYO Germany. So Reza, would you like to speak first?
Yes, thank you very much, Joe, for the opportunity. Honorable speakers, Prof. Charney and Dr. Karen, board members of the Asean Youth Organization in Germany and the Indonesian Student Association in Germany. Good morning from Munich, everyone. I am very pleased to be here today and to have the opportunity to give opening remarks for this webinar. And I want to also to congratulate my fellow board members in the Indonesian Student Association in Germany and AYO Germany for successfully working hand in hand to organize such a terrific webinar about the history of ASEAN. It is really such an honor for us. But let me first of all explain a little bit about our organization, Indonesian Student Association in Germany, or in Bahasa PPI Jerman. It was born formed in Bad Godesberg, a little town near Bonn, in Germany on May 4th, 1956. So this year would be our 66 years anniversary. It was registered as a legal entity in the city of Bonn in 1963. This organization has become the center of cultural integration of Indonesian society in Germany. And also this organization is a non-partisan, scientific, social and independent organization in the form of an association. Our organization consists of Indonesian vocational student, preparatory college student, undergrads, grads, and also doctoral students in Germany. So we have vision together, protect and fight for the interests of its members to improve self-quality and optimize all existing potential for the realization of a just and prosperous Indonesian society. Other than that, PPI Jerman also aims to connect Indonesian students across Germany with other international communities, especially ASEAN communities. Long story short, as I worked as an intern last year in the German Bundestag before I was elected as a leader of PPI Jerman, I have seen lawmakers in Germany talking about the importance of diversifying the German and EU trade and investment in the future. So therefore, the German government drafted the policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific region, with aims not only to diversify the trade and investment to other regions other than China, but also strengthening multilateralism and step up its engagement vis-a-vis ASEAN, and also for strengthening peace, security, and stability in the region, and also to tackle climate change and etc. So therefore, what I'm trying to say, that being said, that this idea of policy guidelines inspires me as a leader of the Indonesian students in Germany to have a vision that our members, especially young Indonesian students, should be exposed more to ASEAN and also the international community in Germany. I've seen that there are still many young Indonesian students who don't have the awareness of ASEAN and what it stands for, and even take this organization for granted. Of course, many naysayers believe that ASEAN would not last a long time when it was founded in 1967, because of many differences between member states in terms of political, economical, and social backgrounds. But ASEAN proved that it is still going strong despite many crises in the past, such as financial crisis and Myanmar crisis. Because ASEAN has so much potential, and I believe would play a big role in the world stage in the near future. I am optimistic that we, as a young generation, could make a big impact on ASEAN to more collaboration. And lastly, I hope that our organization, PPI Jerman and AYO Germany, can work together again on impactful events in the future. Thank you for your attention, everyone. Thank you, Joe. I'm giving back to you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Reza, for the opening remark. That was Reza Kasbullah. He's the president of PPI Germany, or Indonesian Student Association here in Germany. The next opening remark will be from Andy. She's the president from AYO Germany. Go ahead, Andy.
Thank you, Joshua. Can you hear me on?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Thank you. So a warm welcome from me as the representative from the ASEAN Youth Organization Germany. I would like to express my gratitude to everyone involved in making this webinar series successful. This is the first webinar held on ASEAN history. I also would like to extend my gratitude to those participating in this webinar on the history of ASEAN, which is dedicated to young people who are much probably will prefer to stay in bed on Saturday morning. I also would like to express my gratitude to the speakers who readily share their expertise in this field. I'm personally really looking forward to learning from you. I am myself a Southeast Asian graduate and now currently professionally working in an institution that focusing on migration data. Just for those of you who doesn't know what AYO Germany is, almost a year ago, me and Simon, the co-founder of AYO Germany, were having this idea of establishing a country chapter of ASEAN Youth Organization in Germany, which the headquarters itself is already established more or less 10 years ago. It is basically representing the both of us, our interest in the relation of Germany and Southeast Asian country. And I am myself, as an Indonesian, a Southeast Asian youth residing, studied, and working in Germany, and Simon, whose in-depth interest, along with his experience interning in Cambodia, brought together this kind of imagination of building community that perhaps share the same interests as we have. Besides, there is a large number of Southeast Asian youth in Germany, or German with Southeast Asian backgrounds. According to UNDESA, there are around 313,000 Southeast Asians living in Germany as of 2020. Yet this data does not include the German population of Southeast Asian descent. Among them, 50% are Vietnamese and 33% are Thais, followed by a smaller number of other Southeast Asian origins. So as we announced our establishment last year, we have received around 80 applications to volunteer with us. So we can kind of like see like there are a big interest among Southeast Asian youth community here in Germany. And as of today, we are around 24 active volunteers in the first of establishment. So basically our aim as ASEAN Youth Organization is to first explore the potential of engagement among young people from this region and Germany through, for example, this webinar. And secondly, we are seeking to empower young people, Southeast Asian young people in Germany, to get them more active and engaged in social and political activities, because we know being in Germany is already very competitive, and we as organization is looking to provide this platform for young people to kind of sharpen their knowledge and skills in, for example, working in international team in Germany, for example, handling their own projects, coordinating and connecting with high-level institutions, or as simple as networking. So as young people entering social and economic independence along the way, young people will potentially reshape economies, politics, and social relations around the world. International initiatives like us have put the importance of young people at the center stage for sustainable development in the future. But before actually we are looking at the future, we must reflect upon our history. At AYO Germany, we embrace our diversities, adore our cultures and wisdom. But besides that, there are a lot of unfinished business and hurtful wounds in our shared history that is still impacting our day-to-day life. For example, how we trade with the EU or other well-developed countries. It is crucial to look at things in post-colonial perspective, because by all means, we still might have to ask ourselves, the post part of post-colonial, after all this time, do we already pass behind the colonialism, or can we see something that shows the same patterns that look similar, or can we learn from there? And what can we do as young people taking the leadership of the future? How accountable are we? What is our collective responsibility, and what can we learn from our history? That's all from me. I welcome you all, and I believe you will gain insights from this webinar and hopefully useful for every one of us. Thank you.
So, Andy, thank you very much for the opening remark. Before we begin with the presentation from Professor Charney, I would like to ask everyone to enable their camera. I'd like to take some documentation for this event. So once again, I would like to ask everyone to enable their camera. We'd like to take some documentation for this event. Once again, if you guys are able to enable your camera, please do so, as we'd like to take some documentation for this event. Thank you very much. Right. Thank you, everyone. So let's move ahead with the presentation. First one will be Professor Charney. He's going to speak about the political and cultural structure of pre-colonial Southeast Asia. Professor Charney, glad to have you here with us.
Oh, thank you. So technically, I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and I hope this is coming across. If you can see that. Okay. So thanks for inviting me to talk. Now, I come to this as somebody who studied and researched the region now, beginning as a postgraduate student in 1989, so about 33 years devoted to the region. And I've examined different areas at different times, from Kampuchea to Thailand to Myanmar to the Philippines to Indonesia, but always with the idea of understanding Southeast Asia as a whole. Where did Southeast Asia come from? Where did the terminology for Southeast Asia come from? When did we start thinking about it as a region? And although the terminology is more recent, the use of Southeast Asia to refer to the region actually has been used for quite a while. And so we have Malcolm, let me change the slide here. Malcolm, who used the term in 1839, and of course in 1943, technically when the term Southeast Asia began to be used to cover the region in more modern parlance from 1943. But the existence of a region, whatever we called it, is actually much older. Several millennia ago, it was to its neighbors. It was the wilds beyond civilization in the Mahabharata, and the lands in the Southern Ocean to the Chinese, or the Golden Persianese, usually used to refer to the Malay Peninsula, but also Southeast Asia, to the ancient Greeks and to the Romans, and to the seafarers who interlinked the Indian Ocean world. It was the lands below the winds. Now, in beginning to talk about the South Asian past, let me see, actually I should have that on presentation mode. Whoever has their mic on could, oh, I'm sorry, let me stop this. So, okay. Let me stop this for a second. Okay, sorry, that's a pre-recording. Okay, so in beginning to talk about Southeast Asia, at ground zero, one of the questions we often have to deal with is, why did Southeast Asia start to see state formation at a recognizable level to China and other places relatively late? And we have to begin with an extinction level event that ironically began in Southeast Asia 75,000 years ago, when you had a supervolcanic eruption of Toba in Indonesia, the largest eruption that we know ever occurred. It filled the sky of the whole world with ash, 2,800 cubic kilometers of vaporized rock, and the entire surface of the earth was covered with 6 centimeters of ash. And we still see this evidence on every continent today. The sun was dimmed for 6 years. It disrupted seasonal rains, and most early humanoids in the world starved. Temperatures dropped 15 degrees, in some places 20 degrees Celsius. The human level, the number of humans in the world dropped from 1,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals, and so humans face a near extinction event. And so DNA shows that all of us, regardless of what race or ethnicity or whatever we are anywhere in the world, that all of us are descended from the same few thousand people who the only livable space on Earth was left was the coastal parts of Africa. And so out of this original 1,000 to 10,000 number of breeding individuals, the population of humans began to grow again. And when they reach a certain point, they started to migrate out of Africa about 50,000 years ago. And wherever people went, it took so long for people to find a place to have sedentary agriculture, to see the growth of the population, to see the rise of cities. This was all determined on how long it took for people to migrate to one region to another. So we see, the most extreme example in Mesoamerica, we don't see a rise of a lot of these states really until the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, roughly equivalent to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia started to see state formation in the first 1,000 years of the Common Era, and we'll get into that in a second. So eventually, people, concentration of people developed where you had fruitful, well-watered areas that were warm year-round, and eventually people reached Southeast Asia. You had numerous waves of people who migrated in succession. Of those who migrated to the region that we call Southeast Asia, it was just a place to stop on the way to the Pacific Islands, Australia, and even Madagascar. And Malay seafarers moved on to Madagascar about 2,000 years ago. But for those people who stayed, the region of Southeast Asia was a universe of localities. Populations settled where they found life secure if not salubrious, often in safe, mountainous, particularizing geographies. And these mountain valleys may not have borne the agricultural wealth of the lowlands, but they were rich in the metallurgical resources that could feed long-distance trade networks, connecting the area with China and the Indian subcontinent points further on. Populations sought safety in resources first. Now later, in growing numbers, people would find the necessity for food due to more people to feed, but with more people, they found the ability to reposition themselves in the lowlands. And we have O.W. Wolters to thank for models of the transition to early states, which is largely educated guesswork because Southeast Asian past remained proto-historical longer than from many other regions. We don't have all the evidence we need to speak confidently about in detail about the history until relatively late. The working idea we have is that Southeast Asians were originally animus. They had not yet been exposed to universal salvation religions like Islam or Buddhism. They had the idea of soul stuff, a kind of charismatic power that permeated all things, whether we're talking about people or rocks or trees and so on. And in this view, there was a finite amount of soul stuff in the universe. Some people, some things had more soul stuff than others. Those with more were natural leaders, and this was demonstrated through superior physicality or sexual prowess. Life at this time was literally about fighting for survival, and if a warrior could beat everyone in battle, they were accepted as a natural ruler. The problem was that people decline over age physically, and there is always someone stronger somewhere else. So eventually the polities that get built up around the strong man, something like a prehistorical mafia, or for young people, if you watch things like The Walking Dead, a kind of polity that Negan might set up, that these things break up when the strong man is defeated or dies. You can't build anything long-term or stable on this basis. You have no legacy. Whatever polity has been constructed evaporates the moment you can't maintain it with force. So the polity winds up reinventing itself around another strongman. And this leads to very unstable, weak accumulation of wealth. Local societies have to keep rebuilding themselves every 20 years. And you can't have anything of a scale greater than it would take for an individual to complete individual conquests. So again, I often direct people to things like apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic movies or novels to understand what this is like, to give an example of the instability of personality-driven polity formation. Now, and this is where Wolters shines. To overcome this instability, Southeast Asian rulers were receptive now to models provided by universal salvation religions or ethical systems of governance. Largely, this involves Southeast Asian rulers becoming more and more influenced by Brahmanic priests and ascetics such as the Pasupatas, or in the case of Dai Viet, the embryonic state of Vietnam, indigenizing the Confucian system. And we used to question, as scholars, we used to question whether it was traders, warriors, or Brahmin priests who brought Indianization to the region. And that was a term we used at the time. Now we talk about indigenization. But there was a problem because traders would not have had the in-depth knowledge of political theory, religion, and rituals. There were no ruins to indicate conquest by warriors from India, and Brahmanic priests were believed to have traveled out of India, to view travel outside of India as polluting. So who carried this knowledge? Well, Wolters identified the Pasupatas, the world-denying priests who embraced pollution, smeared themselves with cow dung, and hung around ports as a likely vanguard of influencers, to use a contemporary term, in carrying Brahmanism to the region. So now the Southeast Asian king was important, as ruler was important as a king, as a Raja, as a divine intermediary between a Brahmanic god, such as Vishnu or Shiva or Brahma, and devotees. And if followers wished to go to heaven, they needed to obey the ruler who was the connection on earth to the Brahmanic god. In this connection, yeah.
Sorry. Your screen hasn't progressed.
I'm still on Brahmanism.
All right. Okay.
Number 4. Is that not showing to you?
I'm actually unable to see your screen share.
Okay, let me try this again.
Yes, please.
You see that, right?
We see still the beginning, actually.
Okay, I have no idea why that's not resume share. I don't know why that's not. Okay, so introducing, you see number 1 now?
Yeah.
Okay, and this was number 2? I'm sorry you weren't seeing that. Number 3 and number 4. And this is where we are right now.
Oh, we can see it, yeah. But
Yeah.
before, we didn't see it.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Charney.
Yeah, sorry about that. So, this connection involving galactic positioning of the court and the royal city to represent it as a microcosm of the universe. By ruling at the center of this representation of the cosmos, the king maintained universal order on earth as the god did so on the spiritual plane. And this is why Southeast Asian rulers had queens for each of the cardinal points, while we had the churning of the sea of milk represented on the main gate at Angkor or in other bas-reliefs on the Khmer temples, where you have the devas and the apsaras pulling on a naga around the central pivot, sat over by the king of the gods, Indra, maintaining the universal balance of things, maintaining the churning of the sea of milk. So, and this is why, if you look at Burmese thrones, there's a little niche above where the king sits, where you can find an image of Indra, who's looking over the balance of the universe in the same way that the king is overlooking the balance in the kingdom on earth. Now, this changed Brahmanism resolved the problem of impermanence to a certain degree, as it introduced Brahmanic rituals that would remain the basis for sanctification of royal legitimation, really in some parts of Southeast Asia until the present. So we still find this in Cambodia and Thailand. You still find Brahmanic priests who do this. And this meant that rulership was not unstable unless things became really, really, really bad. So the kingdom did not have to reinvent itself every time a ruler died. You had some kind of stability and some kind of inheritance, some kind of legacy that went on to the next generation. As a result, wealth and economic capital, political capital, and so on could be accumulated over time. You could have the continuity of institutions. You could have their increasing sophistication. And this led to the rise of very powerful, long-lasting states. And with this longevity, societies and civilizations stabilized and could grow over time. Core languages of state and religion were adopted and spread through stable polities. Religions remained royal cults, but intellectually and religiously, these were stable homes for the emergence of new centers of thought. Southeast Asia became for a time an integrated part of what Sheldon Pollock has called the Sanskrit Cosmopolis. Southeast Asia, and let me switch to that. So that's one. Okay, so to the, if you look at, no, that's not right either. Oh, sorry. So to the right-hand side, you can see this would have been the world that Southeast Asia was integrated with, what we call the Sanskrit Cosmopolis, in which Sanskrit was lingua franca, and you had these as great centers of Sanskrit thought that would lay the basis for later intellectual thought, not just in India, but in Southeast Asia. This is when you have the spread of the great Indian epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which becomes like the Ramakien in Thailand and becomes the basis for a lot of wayang theater in Indonesia. This is when all this happens, and Southeast Asia is not a subordinate part of this; it is an equal part of this world. There were historically many types of polities which existed in Southeast Asia before the rise of national polities. So, what were they? Well, Southeast Asia was also a central part of the spread of Mahayana Buddhism, interlinking Tang China with India and everything in between. When you think of Europe, as you mentioned in your talk, when you think in your introduction to this, when you think of Europe having a whole Roman Empire, Christianity is their popular description of their historical historicity, common historicity. What would be your equivalent? Well, this is what we would call as your equivalent. This golden era, this classical era, when you have many of the languages, cultural, and political ideas that would be important later on being developed in this core period that Southeast Asia was sharing. However, all of this was doomed to collapse, or better put, to reinvention in a different way. And we had the decline of the classical states. The problem with the existing polities during this classical period was that the world was about to change for three reasons. First, there was the Mongol conquest, and China was the biggest, closest market as it is today. This is not a new thing. It's been for 1,000 years, this case. Under the Tang and later dynasties, the Chinese tributary system would identify a state, and then you could only trade with China through affiliation with that state. And so there was a sprawling trade empire that grew around such a recognized state in the archipelago, Srivijaya. However, when the Mongols conquered China and set up the Yuan dynasty, they ended this practice for the short duration of this dynasty. Anyone could trade with the Yuan. And so the main archipelagic state of the classical era, Srivijaya, collapsed because there was no longer reason for local traders to remain loyal to Srivijaya. Anybody could trade with China during this brief period. Second, when the Yuan dynasty collapsed in the 13th century, you had in the early 14th century, maritime trade resurged again, both in China and Frankish Western Europe. And you had a mushrooming of international trade that ran through the region and provided a new resource for statecraft. The many mainland states that we had at the time were interior-based polities dependent on wet rice agriculture and not on maritime trade. Lots of coastal polities now grew up around the edges of these states and challenged their control of the lowlands. A great example is the challenge, not just of the Chams, but Phnom Penh would pose to Angkor Wat deeper in the on the other side of the Tonle Sap. And so you had this challenge to lowland states and maritime states using wealth to buy off elites, as well as eventually gaining maritime resources like firearms and mercenaries. Third, the intermediary trade between Asia and Europe was conducted through Muslim traders. So at this time, the defeat of the Crusader states in the Middle East and later the rise of the Mughals put Indian Ocean trade into the hands of the Muslims exclusively. Unlike Brahmanism and Islam, every Muslim is a potential proselytizer, so Brahmanism required the priest to spread it. Islam, every Muslim could spread the faith. And to join the Muslim trading world meant adopting Islam, and so the state of Malacca, the heir to Srivijaya, once a non-Yuan Chinese dynasty was put in place to reestablish a tributary system, once you had the rise of Malacca, to join in the Malaccan trading network and to trade with China, you had to join with Malacca, and this meant converting to Islam. So trading through Malacca was advantaged by marriages with the Malaccan royalty, and we have the spread of Islam to the various coastal trading maritime states of the region, of the archipelago. And this included Majapahit, and you see Java converting to Islam, and we see the rise of Mataram. Malacca emerged as the main empire across the archipelago. On the mainland, at the same time, you had a new form of Buddhism, Theravada, which was missionized by monastics from Sri Lanka to the mainland states. And they came with the claim that only some, mainly monks, who could expend the time and energy on meditation, could achieve enlightenment, nirvana. And they depended on the stability and patronage of a ruler of the Dhamma, of the Buddhist law. And this provided a legitimizing tool for the king, helped to make these kingdoms more stable as well. Moreover, it helped to legitimize territorial expansion because the king, as a world ruler, as a Chakravartin, or in the old parlance under the Brahmanism, a spinner of the wheel, he had a world responsibility to ensure stability of the religion wherever it was. And so he used this as a reason, as a pretext to invade and annex neighboring states. And so you have small states growing to very large states in order to preserve the stability, world stability, to ensure the continuity of the current Buddhist dispensation. In Dai Viet, the rulers fended off Chinese invasions and decided the best way to fend them off in the future was to use Chinese-style administration to mimic in Vietnam the Chinese Middle Kingdom. And here we are at the rival of Southeast Asia we see until colonial rule. Muslim trade polities in the archipelago Buddhist kingdoms in the mainland, and a Vietnamese Confucian empire in the northeast. And across these divisions, as Anthony Reid has shown, Southeast Asia shared cultural and social practices that kept this region together, this area together as a single region, the lands below the winds. These common characteristics are a little bit beyond what we're talking about here, but they included things like houses built on stilts, the importance of women relative to neighboring regions, and similar things found to be true across the region. Now, the Portuguese interrupted a great many things when they arrived in 1509 and then took Malacca in 1511. And it was a huge development, and this is undeniable. But it's important to stress here, if we were talking about a Southeast Asia course maybe 40 years ago, just before I was a student, it started to change about the time I was a student, we'd be talking about the Portuguese conquest of Malacca beginning the modern period in Southeast Asia, and everything after that is a story of colonies and everything else. But actually, we know now that's not true, and we look at history a different way. The Portuguese did not destroy indigenous agency. Southeast Asia adapted to an early modern period that had the whole region shared, that was defined by the availability of new generation firearms. They already had firearms from the Chinese, but the new firearms were much better. European and Turkish and other Muslim mercenaries, which helped to make coastal states stronger, and alliances with European powers, and forced migrations. This is all often forgotten. This period is dominated by forced migrations of dislocated Southeast Asians. So you have people like the Bugis who become warriors across the region and hired in different places, and you have other people from South Sulawesi, who wind up actually even in the Cambodian court, serving in Cambodian armies, even taking the throne for a while. This happened across the region, and although there were a small and increasing number of European players, the main players in this period were Southeast Asians. The Portuguese and Spanish efforts to take parts of the mainland were repulsed in Myanmar in 1613 and in Cambodia a little earlier, and French efforts, of course, were repulsed in Thailand in 1688. But the biggest contests in the region were between Southeast Asian mainland states themselves, their armies, their weapons, and their strategic tactics. And a little bit different in the archipelago, which we'll get to in a second. But massive empires on the mainland rose and fell through indigenous warfare, some consisting of warfare covering several decades in duration. So this was a period of terrible violence in the mainland. The story was a little different in the archipelago, where fighting was often but not always between Europeans and indigenous states. The Islamic court of Malacca had moved on elsewhere, where they reestablished themselves and versions of their manner of rule in new locations elsewhere in the region. And they and their allies and people in courts who replicated them sent massive Southeast Asian war fleets that kept Portuguese Malacca preoccupied and not very powerful. And when the Dutch entered the picture in 1600, they went to war with the Spanish and the Portuguese. But the main impact on the Dutch was that they devoted their resources to destroying the indigenous trading ports of the Indonesian archipelago to eliminate competitors in the spice trade and forcing populations inland. And it's here where we get one of the great historiographical debates regarding the region. Anthony Reid argues that this behavior, the Dutch responding to the slump in global prices for spices, ended the great age of movement and urban cosmopolitanisms in the region as a whole, and states and societies became more parochial, inward-looking, and weaker, and the population poorer. And for Reid, this is the beginning of Southeast Asian poverty that would remain in place until the independence period. Victor Lieberman, by contrast, argues that instead, that while much of this is true for the archipelago, the mainland was able to survive the slump by relying instead on overland trade with China, and the more serious disruptions to Southeast Asian prosperity would not actually come until the late 18th century crises that happened across the region later. In either case, however, we have a Southeast Asia argued to have been weakened and made more vulnerable for European conquest. Now, one of the ideas you had about that you mentioned in your description for this meeting was layering, and so your ideas for the topic today, that there are many historical layers that are out of sight of the general Southeast Asia community today. That's very true. We have to talk about layering when we talk about Southeast Asia. And J.C. Van Leur, a famous name now, particularly in Indonesia, who died before his time, argued that European influences, like a great many other foreign influences, were nothing more than a thin flaking glaze, a very famous phrase, thin flaking glaze on a Southeast Asian foundation. He could not have been more right. Southeast Asian society and economy was generally not reshaped at the local levels until the Industrial Revolution began to reshape the world economy and everyone along with it, really for Southeast Asia from the 1830s. Until then, Southeast Asians had layered their influences. We have seen that animism was overcome by Brahmanism, but animism was not erased. Animism instead was layered over with a thin veneer of Brahmanism, and in turn, Brahmanism was not erased by Buddhism and Islam, but these were instead added to an animistic and Brahmanic based and rearticulated as folk Buddhism and folk Islam, and there are other terminologies, but for commonality, I'm using that here. Wherever you find today Islam or Buddhism or whatever in Southeast Asia, Christianity, you find beneath these layers residual ideas about animism and Brahmanism. You find in the culture, the Indian epics, you find a lot of political ideas and terminology that existed in earlier periods that have survived, that have percolated and survived through Islamization and Buddhicization. That helps to provide a common subtext, a common prior text to the region as a whole. In the process, charismatic power was re-understood through a moral lens. If we were talking about Theravada Buddhist Southeast Asia, this became merit. Southeast Asian rulers would also layer their armies with European weapons and tactics on top of a Southeast Asian core, and European administrative devices and technologies on top of a Southeast Asian base. We would find in the 1870s that the Burmese had adopted on their own, before the British, but on a British model, a parliament that was layered over a weakened Southeast Asian kingship, although a coup in 1879 ended this experiment in well, we could call it democracy of a sort, but technically it's not that. Thai rulers would, without colonial rule, also introduce a Western-style bureaucracy and governing practices. And Vietnam would try to copy Western steepishness and technology, but they were otherwise still following the Chinese model. Many other Southeast Asian rulers were looking at what Europe offered to strengthen themselves in the face of a European-dominated rule. Without European rule, we might have seen instead a Southeast Asia today that had adopted Westernization as just another layer over Southeast Asian core. Perhaps to a degree we have anyway, the permeation of pre-existing ideas of culture and religion into contemporary politics, as argued by Benedict Anderson. On the other hand, there was a fundamental change, and although we often view this as essentially European and colonial, I would argue that this was both due to European and capitalist influence on the one hand, and long-term indigenous developments on the other. And I'll take the latter point first. Victor Lieberman provides the most convincing model yet in his strange parallels for the rise of modern Southeast Asian states without stepping at all or very lightly into the colonial period. Earlier historiography offered a picture of colonial change which portrayed modern Southeast Asia as the negative or positive result of colonial interventions. By contrast, Lieberman showed that regardless of the colonial impact, the linguistic, ethnic, cultural, and religious templates for later states in the region was set by about 1830. They were the result of centuries-long developments along the main riverways of the mainland that created structures that colonial regimes could not ignore. Europeans built on indigenous templates from everything to pre-existing elite commoner relations to road infrastructure, and this overlap was so complete that you have many scholars today who mistakenly believe that pre-colonial Southeast Asia had no roads. What was actually the case in many instances is that European roads were built over pre-existing indigenous roads, as were many railway lines, and you have a continuity of ideas of governance, governmentality regarding mobility, popular mobility, and so on, that exists in the pre-colonial period that survives into the colonial period, and then from the colonial period into modern. At the higher levels of governance, European rulers never did more than create a relatively feeble infrastructure over the Southeast Asian country beneath. They essentially focused on the major ports and capital city and leaving the rural areas in the hands of what we might call the forces and structures of indigeneity. And they inherited rather than created the divisions between lowland or inner island states and highland or outer island autonomy. The European nature of colonial regimes were not what was not what had the larger impact. Instead, what had a larger impact was a combination of global capitalism and modern administrative technologies. Both of these were impacting people everywhere in rural Europe and America as much as in Asia. They were not peculiar to the colonial experience, but because they overlapped it, they are often confused as being essentially and peculiarly intertwined. So let's disentangle them. The motor of the Industrial Revolution was transforming the global economy and everyone with it. Colonialism was a stage in which commerce had not transformed quickly enough to keep pace with industrialization. So Western states took resources by force and acquired markets by force. Some areas of the world were marked for industry and others for cash crops and raw materials. But the transition from patronage relations to commercial and contractual ones was the same for all societies globally, as Europeans and Americans would discover in the late 20th century when their jobs eventually went somewhere else. Economic forces were transforming everyone's life everywhere, and this would have happened in Southeast Asia, whether they were under colonial rule as they were, or whether they were under indigenous states had European colonial rule never happened. And Thailand is a great example of this. From about 1830 in Java with the cultivation system, and various later reformist iterations, and in each area, even before colonial rule was begun, global capitalism was already transforming commercial relations. Where the state resisted commercial penetration that circumvented royal monopoly, it was overthrown, and where it agreed by treaty to change, such as in Thailand, it was preserved. Those states at the center of global capitalism, Britain and the US, could let their colonies go more easily than others, and so they actually didn't fight against wars of liberation in their colonies after the World War II. But we would see that in Indonesia and Indochina, the French and the Dutch would. In terms of those winning administrative apps that Neil Ferguson has identified, censuses, cartographical regimes, Western schools for elites, and the like, these spread independently of colonial regimes. Certainly, India afforded a blank canvas for the Great Geographical Survey, but once the technology was proved, it spread regardless of which state was in control because the advantages for governance were obvious. And this has been shown by Thongchai Winnachaku in his Siam map for Thailand, and it's fairly easy to suggest that other Southeast Asian states, had they not been colonized, would have followed a similar path as did Thailand. And this was also true of censuses. Southeast Asians had remained adaptive in their identities to reflect contemporaneous political and other realities, and this extended to ethnic identities, as James Scott and others have argued. But fluidity is more conducive to survivalist societies of scale than large management states, and the census was a hugely useful tool in fixing people in place for easy and durable management over time. Indigenous ethnic diversity contracted substantially, the diversity of ethnic terminologies disappeared, and the Southeast Asians were now legible to the state in a way never before possible. And this was a boon for the state, whether it was indigenous or colonial. The spread of European Western education amongst elites was also a development begun not by colonial regimes, but by pre-colonial states in the region, such as Myanmar and later Thailand. They sent their elite children to Western schools in Europe, or established these schools in their own capitals to educate them for what they accepted as education in modern governance, modern technology, and modern warfare. Without European rule in the colonial period, the mainland, and for the mainland I include here the Malay states, would, I argue, have experienced the period in a manner similar to how Thailand experienced it historically. Instead of this just being the Thai experience of the 19th and 20th centuries, it would have been the Southeast Asian experience. In the mainland, we would have had roughly the same states we have today, with the exception, arguably, of Laos. What was a European creation was the uber state of Indonesia out of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines and, of course, Singapore. We would have seen instead probably a myriad of small states like Sulawesi and Borneo or Kalimantan and places like this instead of the Indonesia that we see today. And we would have seen autonomous sultanates and the independent sultanates in the south emerging as modern states instead of as part of a modern integrated Philippines. But even here, much of the languages, cultures, and religions, the pre-colonial template had been set independently of European rule. And all of the indigenous states, had they not been conquered, would have still been self-westernizing indigenous states, as Thailand is often described. In all of them, we would still have seen the rise of popular nationalism and mass political organization that borrowed on Western models. We often forget that China and Japan experienced the same kinds of organizational evolutions and mass political mobilizations that colonial Southeast Asia had, without them being colonized themselves. In other words, because of the integration into the global economy, and by being states per se at this time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, all the changes we usually associate with colonial transformations of the region would have happened more or less anyway. This includes the immigration of vast numbers of Asian immigrant minorities, the Chinese and the Indians we find often associated with colonial rule. Harry Benda suggested at one time that this was one of the key changes of colonial rule, that the indigenous rulers had kept immigration in check, but the Europeans opened the floodgates to this immigration. The transformations of the Industrial Revolution and global economy in the late 19th century would have required cash cropping and rapid concentrations of labor that Southeast Asian economies were not yet prepared for without major inputs of labor from abroad. And so we see in the colonial period that the areas which saw the highest influx of Chinese and Indians were the areas that had the poorest concentrations of existing labor. To survive as a state required feeding at primary agricultural produce and raw materials, whereas most of the population were already committed to subsistence agriculture with a minimum to moderate surplus paid to the crown. Without the additional immigrant labor, even had the region not been colonized, local states would have faced famine in adjusting their economy sufficiently. European rule also did not provide a sense of Southeast Asia to the region. The main references I mentioned to begin by Westerners to Southeast Asia region were Malcolm in the 19th century in 1830 and the Southeast Asia Command from 1943 on opposite sides of the colonial period. In between, Europeans manufactured various ways to understand the region in ways that divided the region but did not unify it. Regional schemes always benefit those who hold power, and it was only because of Southeast Asia played a role in Cold War strategy that the U.S. encouraged an area studies that unified the region, but as a region fractured along the boundaries of the free and communist worlds. Southeast Asians would have to discover unity out of the ashes of colonial and Cold War divisions, not out of any gift or legacy of Western rule. Now, I'm going to conclude here briefly. In conclusion, I'd like to turn briefly to consideration of decolonizing history, which is a popular approach nowadays, but we've been doing this in Southeast Asian historiography in different ways, calling it something else since the 1970s, going back to autonomous history. Nevertheless, we historians have tended to give the European colonizers agency in everything until the rise of nationalist parties and leaders in the 1920s and 1930s. And I think this is wrong. I think the main impact of the colonial period was not actually that it deprived agency, but it created the imaginary that Southeast Asians lacked agency. That there's a sense that of deprivation of actual potential agency that it took from Southeast Asians. Southeast Asians were never hesitant to take advantage and adopt new winning technologies, or again, as Neil Ferguson calls them, new apps. They became anemic to things because they were now deemed foreign. So historically, they never avoided new ideas, new technologies, these new apps, but they became so in the immediate post-independence period because they were tinged with being foreign. So Southeast Asian states immediately began to expunge themselves of a great many winning technologies and institutions, and as well as people on the basis of being tinged with Westernism, who might have otherwise helped Southeast Asia in the early post-war independence period build a stronger Southeast Asia more quickly. Now, Southeast Asia has recovered. It's regained this confidence, and you see that in all kinds of ways. And some of the ways are in terms of the aid programs they have. So Thailand has an aid program that reaches places outside of the region. Jokowi in Indonesia has undertaken the first steps towards FTAs between Indonesia and Africa and Indonesia and Latin America. And you have Duterte, who has no problem being confident in playing off the U.S. and the PRC against each other. The confidence of Southeast Asia to be a world player is back again. And for this reason, I'm not going to say too much more because this will step into the portion of today's session covered by my colleague from NTU. I am not too worried, as the West and Japan seem to be, about the PRC taking advantage of the region. I think Southeast Asia can handle that. And I think Southeast Asia can be able to play that influence. We're going to see Southeast Asian states and societies take the best that modern PRC has to offer. But this will not be a complete conversion. This will be yet only another layer. It will be a Southeast Asia that remains Southeast Asia, open to the world and taking advantage of new opportunities with a confidence. Southeast Asia's long history makes it clear that Southeast Asia will continue to use what is available to chart its own course to prosperity. And I will stop on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Charney. That was a really interesting lecture. It really helps us to understand how Southeast Asia was territorially understandable in the past and what kind of politics were there in Southeast Asia before colonization. Professor Charney even gave us a little bit of foresight in the future of how if PRC will dominate Southeast Asia. And now on to the second lectures. Dr. Karen, she'll give us a lecture about political and cultural structure of post-colonial Southeast Asia and the grounding of ASEAN. It will really help us to answer how did colonization change the political constellation of Southeast Asia, and how did nationalism emerge in today's Southeast Asian countries, and also why and how did the countries of Southeast Asia decide to establish ASEAN. So go ahead, Dr. Karen. We're very pleased to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let me share the slide first. Okay, let's see if I can share the slide. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. Can you see my slides now?
Yep, you can see it now.
Okay. Yes, as I mentioned to the organizers that I am trained as a political economist, so I may not be able to touch on all aspects of the history of the post-colonial Southeast Asia. So what my presentation is going to be about the political economy of, focusing on the political economy part of the post-colonial Southeast Asia. For what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about how the Cold War dynamics led to the bifurcation of the development trajectory of 10 Southeast Asian states. And then I'll talk about the after the Cold War ended, what happened. There was the Asian financial crisis of late 1990s, which create another shared event for the political economy of Southeast Asia at that time. And then I'll talk a little bit about ASEAN, its formation, etc. And then I'll end with one contemporary, one current issue, which is the COVID-19 pandemic and ASEAN initiative to exit from this pandemic. So it's going to be about the political economy. It's going to be political economy focus for my lecture. Okay, without further ado, let me turn my slide. So just to connect with Professor Charney's lecture, so I'm going to cover the period from independence to today. So basically, as you can see that after World War II ended, there's a wave of newly independent states. So there was a wave of political independence from the Western and Japanese colonizer that occupy some parts of Southeast Asia during World War II. So I think I'll just skip this because I think you can just find this on the internet yourself. But I just want to show you that there's a wave of new state, newly independent Southeast Asian states. Okay, but let me give you the picture of what the post-World War II economy looked like. Right? What actually this picture out there. So basically, after World War II, as you know, there was an establishment of the Bretton Woods system, which become, WTO today, become World Bank today, and become IMF today, right? So the Bretton Woods system created this new structure, new governance structure of governing the world economy, right? And the WTO predecessor is called GATT, so it's General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. And because after World War II, there was a wide belief that trade is good because it served as an engine of growth. Right? So, and as I mentioned earlier, there was a wave of newly independent states emerging in many parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. And also as I mentioned earlier, that it looks like if you look at the Bretton Woods system, it was propagating that trade is good, is an engine of growth, right? But we have to factor into account the Cold War dynamics, which actually bifurcated the development trajectory of Southeast Asian country, because some country in the region fell under USSR camp, the other fell under the US camp. Right? Okay, let me give you how did bifurcation look like. So yeah, if you can just divide up Southeast Asian country into two groups, one with Soviet Union, one with US camp, right? So let's talk about the Soviet Union camp. So we have the Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam that actually adopted kind of the Soviet-style state-led economic development model. So in this model, state has control over land ownership and production. Right? So the industries become nationalized, and and private investment eliminated, and it tend to prioritize self-sufficiency. Now, okay, so yeah, so why there are some advantages? Because you can have state control. It's good at distributing gains from the economy, right? So it helps with the equality or equity distribution of economic gain. But the problem is that it let the state control the economy. So it means that state had to intervene in the market, which may not give which may not be able to achieve efficiency, right? As you know from what we talk among the economists and political economists, that once the market intervenes, so once the state intervenes in the market, you lose the efficiency as a result, right? So okay, let me move on to another camp. So what are the other camp? The folks, the Southeast Asian state that were in the US camp. So what are the economic development model, right? So these countries adopted what we call market-led economies, but there are two main approaches to market-led economies. So one is called import substitution industrialization. The other one is called EOI, export-oriented industrialization, or export-led growth or industrialization. Let me talk about ISIs first. So this is actually, this ISI and EOI actually talk about the same thing. They embrace the market, right? But they have different approach in terms of developing the countries. So for ISI, as the name says, is called import substitution industrialization. So what it means that this approach will put up barriers, right? So they try to roll out measures that they can prepare the country so that they can substitute imports. So the Southeast Asian country no longer have to import or rely on imports from the outside. They can just be self-reliant or producing something that used to be produced by other countries. So ISI, if country took this approach, they would put up barriers to block imports from coming in, right? And they also roll out some measures to grow their informed indigenous industry so that these industries can compete internationally. So there was an approach taken by many Southeast Asian countries in the USSR camp from, since their independence until 1950s to 1960. And by 1960 and early 1970, all Southeast Asian country in the US camp actually moved toward EOI. Why is that? It is because ISI, even though it kind of creates opportunity for info industry to grow and compete internationally, but it also have a lot of problems. So one is that this approach based success hinges largely on the domestic market, which if you think about it, Southeast Asian countries are not that large. Many Southeast Asian are not large economies, right? So they lack economy of scales for informed industry to grow. Also, another problem with ISI is that it can be prone to abuses. For example, how can you know for sure, right, which sector that you're going to promote and is going to be competitive internationally, right? So that that creates a room for corruption or for abuses that government can just pinpoint some sectors and try to develop that sector, the sector that their friends or families invested in, right? So that's also another problem with ISI as well. Okay, let's move on to EOI. So by 1970s, all Southeast Asian countries in the US camp adopted this export-oriented industrialization. So this one is actually the opposite of what ISI advocates, which is that EOI actually uses the foreign demands to stimulate the economic growth. So in contrast to ISI, we rely on domestic demand to develop the economies, right? EOI is actually uses foreign demands to develop the economy. So, but if you look closely at this approach, it was successful to help grow the economies, grow specific economies. So one industry that is actually become the the beneficiary of this EOI is the resource-intensive industries. So for example, like extraction or oil. For example, many Southeast Asian countries produces natural resources, right, like oil or mineral or natural gas, etc. So these industry took off once Southeast Asian nations adopted EOI. And another sector that took off as well is you can see as a listed here, the foodstuff, raw material, right, as well as labor-intensive manufacturing, right. As you know, Southeast Asian countries at that time, the wages in Southeast Asian countries were very competitive, right? It was much cheaper than wages in other countries. So it created an opportunity for labor-intensive manufacturing, like textile and footwear, that you need a lot of labor to produce it, right? To took off and grow. Yeah. So this EOI. So let's move fast forward to when Cold War ended. Right? So this is the Berlin Wall, as you in Germany would know very well. So Cold War ended. So Cold War and the end of Cold War is another watershed event affecting Southeast Asia political economy as well. So why is that? Because the end of Cold War created what? So the end of Cold War effectively created the U.S. dominance, right? So USSR actually collapsed. So the last one standing was actually the U.S. So what happened is that once the U.S. become dominant, it preached the what we call Washington Consensus, which is 10 principles, a set of 10 principles that try to promote free market, right? So if you just Google the Washington Consensus, you will see that there were the ideas that U.S. was propagating, right? For example, trade liberalization, open to foreign investment, privatization, deregulation, etc. Right? So this is what happened. Okay, this is the first effect of the end of Cold War, is that it was the U.S. dominant. So the second effect, after the Cold War ended, was the globalization, right? So actually the globalization happened during 1980s as well, but after the Cold War ended, the rate of globalization actually accelerated. So what happened? Well, how does it affect the political economy of Southeast Asia? Right? Because globalization, one part of globalization is that it is the international flows of capital and investment, right? Because partly due to the rise of technology, that you can just transfer money across borders more easily than before. Right? Okay, so the globalization led to the freer flow of capital across border, and I will show you later how that actually contributed to the Asian financial crisis Okay, let me move on to the next period from Asian financial crisis to now. So what happened to the political economy of Southeast Asia? Okay, let me talk a bit about the decade before the crisis, around late 1980s to 1996, right? So if you look at Southeast Asia, of course, as you know, like Southeast Asia was trying to develop the economy, as I said earlier, adopting ISI, EOI, etc. So, but the decade before the crisis, if you look at this period, it looks very rosy for Southeast Asia, right? You look at the annual growth rate of ASEAN 5 countries, it was close to 8%, which is because it's huge. And another thing is that there's an influx of capital flows coming in to the region. So if you tally up the number, is actually 100 billion US dollar in 1996, just before the crisis started, right? So huge money coming in. And if you look closely at other macroeconomic indicator like inflation or unemployment, this is very low, which is great, right? So you have a region that grows very fast with little inflation, little unemployment. But look, this is really good. But that is just on the surface, because if you look closely into the detail, you will find that Southeast Asia during that time has a lot of weaknesses in their financial system. Why is that? Because Southeast Asian financial system during that time was not well developed to effectively assess who they should lend or should not lend, right? So as a result, they don't have like effective screening procedures in the financial system. So that's why they end up with a lot of bad loans or defaults, right? So, so as you can see, I just want to show you that, yeah, at a glance, looks very good for Southeast Asia, but deep down, there's a lot of problem. The problem is actually developing, and it actually came out at the Asian financial crisis in 1997. Okay, let me show you this. Okay, let me move back to this slide first. So the weakness in the financial system, right? Once investor began seeing a lot of bad loans increase over time, they actually question whether Southeast Asian countries are actually the economy is actually doing well, right? And I forgot to mention one point, that at that time, many Southeast Asian nations fixed the exchange rate to the US dollar. So they adopted fixed exchange rate. So one reason to adopt fixed exchange rate is that it kind of stabilized the economy, right? So it stabilized the exchange rate so that it can facilitate international trade among countries. So, but the weakness of a fixed exchange rate system is that it's prone to what we call speculative attacks, meaning that, some investors who question the real value of the baht or the Indonesian rupiah or Malaysia ringgit can just short the currencies by taking the local currency to the bank and then convert it into US dollar, right? So the speculative attack was actually happening because the many investors are seeing bad loans coming out in large number, and they are question whether the Thai economy was actually as good as it looks at that time. So the speculative attacks happened in Thailand to the Thai baht, and it was successful. So it led to the devaluation of the baht in July 1997. But it didn't stop in Thailand, though. This financial crisis, yeah, it started in Thailand, but it spread throughout Southeast Asia and beyond. Right. So, for example, just give you some timeline. So, the Thai baht devalued in July 1997. By the end of August, Malaysia ringgit, Indonesia rupiah, Philippine peso were also down. And then moving on to September 1997, Singapore dollar, Taiwanese dollar were under attack. And then in November 1997, South Korean won went down. So as you can see, there was a spread because it caused by the panic. People are not, well, people thought, at that time, people thought that, okay, if Thai economy was vulnerable, let me take a look at other vulnerable economies in the region that share some fundamentals with Thai economy. Right? So, and speculative attack happened in other countries as well. So that's why at the end of, let me show you this picture first. At the end of, at the end of 1997 to the beginning of 1998. So as you can see, all regional currency went down, right? So you can just use 100 here as benchmark, and you can see that all were down, right, by early 1990s. Okay, let me move back to this slide first. So, okay, yeah, maybe I'll just skip the double mismatch problem. I think you can just search it for yourself. So double mismatch problem talks about the causes of the Asian financial crisis. Maybe just in brief, just to give you some idea. So double mismatch problem is actually consists of two mismatch that are happening that trigger the financial crisis in the 1997. So one type of mismatch is called maturity mismatch. Maturity mismatch happens when you borrow short and lend long, and that is actually happening. What's happening in Southeast Asia a decade before the crisis. For example, some Southeast Asian banks borrow from US bank or other Western bank and borrow in a short term, maybe, for example, okay, they have to, return the principal plus interest in a year, but they actually lend longer than that. So these banks actually lend for 30 years. So because during that time, the Thailand economy was developing, so there was a lot of construction going on. So the construction projects last for 10, 20, 30 years, right? So borrow short, lend long is called maturity mismatch. So why is it a problem? It's a problem because you have to service your debt at a short period of time, but your investment will give you, profits in a very long period of time, right? So you have problem with cash flow. You cannot find, money to pay back to your loan on time. So that's one, for the first part of the double mismatch problem, maturity mismatch. So the second part of the double mismatch problem is called currency mismatch. So currency mismatch happens when the currency that you borrow is actually different from the currency that you lend out. So that's actually the case in Southeast Asia because they borrow in USD, right? You borrow from US bank, Western bank in USD, but they lend in local currencies, right? So why is it a problem? It's a problem because if your local currency devalue, right, the burden of you servicing your debt in foreign currency will double or triple, right? So actually that happened in Thailand when the Thai baht devalued. So the Thai baht before the financial crisis, the exchange rate is 20 baht per USD. But after the devaluation of the baht, the exchange rate is 50 baht to 1 USD, right? So you can see it's double. The debt service double. So I just want to share with you the double mismatch problem here. Okay, and I think as you probably know already that once the Asian financial crisis was a watershed event in the region, and many Southeast Asian countries went to IMF for help, right? So IMF gave loans, but IMF not only gave loans to these troubled economy, but IMF also design and control the what we call the structural adjustment program, meaning that IMF would demand that the borrowing Southeast Asian countries to follow the policies that IMF dictated, right? So that's actually created a lot of anger and a lot of what they call a lot of anger and the pushback against the IMF and the West, and that actually led to the ASEAN +3 financial process, which I will talk about that later. Okay, let me move on to this slide. I would highly recommend you to watch this Commanding Height commentary series part 3, which actually very well covers the development of Asian financial crisis, Asian financial crisis and its aftermath. Right. So it talked more about what I'm presenting to you now. So it talked not only about how Asian financial crisis led the IMF to come into the country and create a lot of anger among local leaders, but it also talked about the fact that the Asian financial crisis actually shaped the political economic dynamic within the country for good, right? For example, just to give you an example of Indonesia, right? Before the financial crisis hit the country, you had Suharto regime, right? So, but once AFC, Asian financial crisis, hit the country, it wiped out, the Suharto and his friend and cronies, right? So you get the post-Suharto political economy afterward. Yeah. Same in Thailand as well. There was Asian financial crisis led to the collapse of the Thai government and led to the rise of, entrepreneur turned politician Thaksin Shinawatra, right? And the Thai Rak Thai Party. There was the rise of Thai Rak Thai Party during that time. So yeah, not only my point is that not only that Asian financial crisis created ASEAN +3 process, which I will talk about that in a minute, but it also internally changed the political economic landscape of many Southeast Asian countries. And you can see the remnant of it today as well. Okay, moving on. Okay, I just talk about this a little bit before I move on to ASEAN +3 financial process. So yeah, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, from when I talked about the Commanding Height documentary series. So yeah, so you have you see a lot of changes in the post-financial crisis Southeast Asia. One is that you see a lot of economic reform. Well, partly these were driven by the IMF program, right? The IMF actually forced Southeast Asian nations to reform the economy, to close down insolvent banks, to reform financial system, impose more financial regulation on on the trust fund, etc. Right. So that's economic reform. Institutional change, I talked about that a little bit earlier. That in some ASEAN country, AFC is actually trigger regime change, right, and change the political landscape of the country for good. Right. But if you look closely at specific industry, we can observe some industrial reform as well. Like, for example, you can see Singapore doing technological upgrading, Malaysia as well, Thailand. But Thailand is little reform. So the industrial reform was not actually shaped by AFC, but it's actually also shaped by other factors as well. Right? So industrial reform, you will witness some industrial reform in some Southeast Asian country, but in other countries, maybe the reform was in a lesser degree. Okay, let me show you this one that I talked about that earlier, the ASEAN +3 financial process. Right? So AFC, Asian financial crisis, was a watershed in the region, but one good thing that emerged out of it is that it was the creation of ASEAN +3 financial cooperation process. Okay, so ASEAN +3 is actually a cooperation among 10 ASEAN member states plus three countries, China, Japan, and South Korea. So why is it a good thing that emerging out of AFC? Is this because if you look at the history of regional financial cooperation, before Asian financial crisis is so little, or you can say almost none of this cooperation. But after AFC happened, suddenly 10 ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, South Korea joined force to create the financial cooperation process, which are actually functioning today, right? For example, it gave rise to what we call CMI or CMIM. CMI stands for Chiang Mai Initiative. CMIM is Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization. Okay, ABM. This is actually the what we call the liquidity provision mechanism, right? It kind of created a pool of reserves that member state that the members 13 countries can tap upon when the next crisis hits the economy, right? So it kind of served as kind of like the extension of the IMF, if you can see it. So you can say it that way. So ABMI is actually stand for ASEAN +3 Bond Market Initiative. So this one is actually, well, creating a bond market in order to raise local currency investment and keep this local currency investment within the country, right? So ERPD is I forgot the full name. And AMRO is actually ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Region Research Office, which is based in Singapore. So ERPD and AMRO are actually providing surveillance. It's a surveillance body. So it's a body, a mechanism that monitor macroeconomic conditions of ASEAN +3 nations. And actually they have, the early warning system. So if they monitor the economy and feel and find that some countries are having, macroeconomic problem, right? These entities will warn the governments that, okay, we think that your economy is going to be prone to the next crisis, right? So this early system kind of help prevent the next financial crisis hitting the East Asian region. So I just want to show you the ASEAN +3 financial process, which was born out of the Asian financial crisis. Okay, let me move on to, I just want to talk about ASEAN a little bit to give you some idea because I think this is an ASEAN class. So let me talk a little bit about history of ASEAN, and then I'll wrap up with my discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic and ASEAN initiative to address it. Okay, so many of you know already that the ASEAN was formed during the Cold War era, right? So it was formed by what the declaration called Bangkok Declaration of 1976. Sorry, 1967. I think a typo error on that. So basically there was, the ASEAN was actually initially was a security, bloc. It was formed out of security concerns, right? Because the Cold War was heated during this time, and five ASEAN countries, the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and Singapore, got an idea that, well, we need to band together to create a zones of peace, so that we can, so that the rise of communism would not affect us. So that's the origin of ASEAN formation. Okay, let me show you some details of Bangkok Declaration. So basically, it talks about many things. So first of all, it talks about cooperation in many realms, right, ranging from economy to education. It also talked about the promotion of regional peace and stability. Okay, it also talk about an organization that represents the collective will of the member state, and also it talks about peace, freedom, and prosperity. Okay, just to give you some idea here that how the ASEAN that was formed in 1967 was different from ASEAN that you're seeing today. So ASEAN in 1967, as I said earlier, it was formed out of security concerns. So it's more of like, so the cooperation during the initial years were heavily on security, right? Okay, so 1990s, but 1997 to 1977 to 1998, you see a period of ASEAN membership expansion, right? So the organization accepted Brunei in 1984, and then after the Cold War ended, you see that the ASEAN embraced Southeast Asian countries that were in USSR camp into the organization, right? So Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia joined by 1999, okay? And during this period, I just want to highlight that there was another, big trade liberalization initiative that was signed by many Southeast Asian leaders. This is called ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, which is actually one of the region-wide FTA or free trade arrangement during that time. And this will become a trigger for other economic cooperation initiative to emerge later. Okay, moving on to 1998 to 2007, this period was regarded as a formalization period. This period was actually, if you look at this period, you will see a lot of documents or agreement being signed by 10 ASEAN member states. So there was a period of, acceleration of cooperation on many fronts among ASEAN countries. Okay, and then and then the last period is 2008 to now. Sorry, I have typo. 2008 to now was what we call the period of community building, because ASEAN want to integrate more with each other to form as what they call ASEAN community. Okay, let me show you. So this is actually just to show you that ASEAN has a charter. I think you can just Google it. It's a very small book here. Okay, but it talks about the rules that govern 10 member states. Okay. Moving on to ASEAN community building. I think many of you may know that ASEAN are trying to deepen their cooperation in 3 big areas, which is represented by 3 pillars of ASEAN community. Okay, so one pillar is called ASEAN Political Security Community. The second one is called ASEAN Economic Community. And the third one is called ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. Right? So as you can see, if you look at the name, the ASEAN member states try to deepen cooperation in the political security area, in economic area, and in socio-cultural area. Okay, just want to show you, because I'm political economist by nature, so my focus is actually on AEC, ASEAN Economic Community. And just want to flag it up very quickly that ASEAN Economic Community is still an ongoing project. We have what we call roadmap or blueprint that which contain measures, policy measures to be achieved in order to realize ASEAN Economic Community by 2025. For those of you who are interested, you can just click on this link or Google Google and read through this blueprint. Okay, so just to show you briefly, this is the structure of the blueprint. So it talks about it says that the AEC 2025 consists of 5 characteristics, right? So it's actually highlighted in the red block box here. So 5 characteristics are a highly integrated and cohesive economy, a comprehensive, innovative, and dynamic ASEAN, an enhanced connectivity and sectoral cooperation, a resilient, inclusive, and people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN, and last but not least, a global ASEAN. So basically, it has the AEC 2025 has 5 characteristics, and under each individual characteristic, these are the areas of cooperation. Like, for example, in order to achieve a highly integrated and cohesive economy, ASEAN has to roll out some measures to beef up trading goods, trading services, measures to beef up investment and environment, etc. Right. So as you can see, these are in blue box. These are the specific areas of cooperation to achieve individual characteristic of AEC. Okay, moving on. Okay, I'll end with one of the current event that is ongoing right now, which is COVID-19 pandemic. Right? So as you know, COVID-19 pandemic happened in early 2020, and it caused a lot of supply chain disruption, right? And it also caused a lot of economic damage to countries around the world, including Southeast Asian countries as well. So, but if you look closely, the effect is uneven. So the pandemic tend to hit more tend to hit the most vulnerable groups the hardest, right? The most vulnerable group, what I mean by this is that those folks who work in informal sector, or women, or the one that are less educated or poor, right? So these are hit the most by the pandemic, right? So it's what the pandemic happened, it is kind of widen the fault lines in the society. So not only that you're seeing economic damage that are happening in many Southeast Asian nations, but you also see a lot of the worsening of social inequality and social tension within Southeast Asian countries as well, right? So for those of you who are interested in political economy of Southeast Asia, this is another watershed event happening in the country, and it can reshape the political economic dynamics of individual countries in Southeast Asia as well. Okay. Another thing I just want to highlight for the pandemic is that the pandemics actually increased the role of states, right? So for those who study economy or political economy, you know that there's a huge debate about what is the role of state, how much state should intervene or involve in managing the economy, right? So some would say, okay, state should be completely out of managing the economy. Some would say that, well, state should totally control the economy, right? So there's a debate going on between the role of state. But the pandemic has actually increased the significance of the role of state in managing the economy. So you will see a lot of state a lot of rescue packages or stimulus packages that are rolled out by many government or many states in Southeast Asia, right? So that has increased the role of the state here. Okay, so just to give you some idea that you will see a lot of stimulus packages being rolled out to rescue regional economies from the pandemic, right? And the scale is actually huge. I don't think I have the, I'm sorry, I didn't have the slide to show you the scale, but it's actually bigger than the stimulus packages that were rolled out to help the economy weather as Asian financial crisis in 1997. So actually basically the packages, the degree of government rescue is actually larger here than in 1997, okay? So at the regional level, what should we be concerned or what should be considered during this period? Because if you think about COVID-19 pandemic, right, to some extent it creates what we call the region divergent forces. Because of the tight economic situation that each individual Southeast Asian country experiences, they may turn inward, right? They may become more protectionist and put up trade barriers and turn inward just to safeguard their domestic constituencies at the expense of other countries, right? And that could undermine the efforts to deepen regional integration by ASEAN, right? So this is one of the concerns about the pandemic on the effort to further cooperation or advance cooperation. So that's why, okay, let me show you this a bit, that the degree of the COVID-19 pandemic is actually larger than the degree of damage inflicted by Asian financial crisis. Okay, just moving back to my point that, okay, because COVID-19 pandemic could make individual country turning inward and become more protectionist, right? That trigger a huge policy question about, so how can we regalvanize regional integration effort again during this tough time, right? So what happened is that in November 2020, ASEAN leaders got together and endorsed what we call ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, or ACRF, and its implementation plan. So what this ACRF is about is actually serve as a region-wide exit strategy from the pandemic. And it's actually, so it said that ASEAN will eventually exit from the pandemic. And here are the 5 broad strategies that will enable 10 member states to exit from the pandemic. So as you can see, just go very quickly on this. So 5 broad strategies are, one is, to beef up the health system. The second is to strengthen human security. The third one, is about, advancing intra-ASEAN and, broader economic integration between ASEAN and non-ASEAN economies. And number 4 is to, capitalize on digital transformation. And digital transformation has to be inclusive to not only that the rich can capitalize on it, but the poor and disadvantaged should be able to use this digital transformation in their life as well. And number 5 is actually the region's resilience and sustainability. So going forward from the pandemic to the future, how can we make the region more resilient, be able to bounce back better from the next crisis and develop in a sustainable way? Okay, so that would end my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions during the discussion. Thank you.
Right. Dr. Karen, thank you very much for the very interesting lecture too, especially on the economic and cooperation in ASEAN. So we'll now begin the group discussion. Like we mentioned, maybe we have a little bit less time than we planned, but it's okay. I'd like to touch up on a couple of things. And I have also a question for Dr. Karen and Professor Charney, especially on the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. I really believe countries who trade with each other are less likely to go to war with each other. The Asian financial crisis in the late 90s had such a huge impact on Southeast Asia, especially on my country. It even brought down Suharto's dictatorship that lasted for 32 years. One important aspect, I think I'd say, the Suharto government, they really emphasize on the economical miracle in Indonesia. And I think the Asian financial crisis brought down that thing, I'd say. It changed a lot. Some would argue it changed the economic of Southeast Asia for the worse, but some would also argue that it changed the economic of Southeast Asia for the better. I'd say the economic in Southeast Asia is much more robust now and much more stable than it used to be. So on to my question for Dr. Karen and Professor Charney, how do you see the cooperation, economic cooperation and political cooperation of Southeast Asia in the coming years, especially after the pandemic years? Maybe Professor Charney, you would like to answer first?
Well, I'm not an economist, but I think that there, from the previous talk, you're looking at the economic factors, and it's certainly with BRI and other emergence of AFTA and everything else, you're going to have a lot more economic integration, and it's not just economic integration at the state economy level, it's also the economies are deepening, and so you have lots of social support systems that you didn't have before. A lot of things came in place in your country, Indonesia. You had a lot of things put in place to help everyday people. I think there were 5 different programs that were adopted to help everyday people and small businesses and so on way through the crisis. So you have this kind of thing happening. And so as economic integration takes place, as the country becomes wealthier and they become more interdependent on each other, yeah, you're going to have the ASEAN just become stronger and grow. Now, when we put this into security conversations, though, people are throwing in things like, well, how is the pressure from the Quad and versus China? How is that going to disintegrate ASEAN? And that's the political element to all of this. And that's where we draw in the PRC and, the fear from the West. The PRC has won over Cambodia and is possibly Brunei to pay off, as its oil fields have matured. It's going to be more dependent on aid, and China's going to be able to manipulate there. And of course, Laos is often portrayed as a Chinese proxy. And you have voices of discontent within ASEAN that this larger context of this standoff between China and the U.S., it's actually Quad, that's going to lead to a fracture. It may disintegrate ASEAN. So that's it. You have the economic forces to keep it together, but you have the political forces to tear it apart. It's how ASEAN leaders deal with that tension, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Charney. I would agree with that point. I think in the coming years, ASEAN requires a higher cooperation between the countries that are involved, especially with the emergence of China. And Dr. Karen? Maybe?
Yes, I think going forward from the economic cooperation in the coming years would likely be shaped by three major forces. So one is that what Professor Charney said is the US-China rivalry, or the second one is the COVID-19 pandemic, and the third one is the Ukraine-Russian war. Right? So if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned in my lecture, that it can create some regional divergent forces where country will turn inward, and put up barriers to protect and pursue protectionism. And this actually happened during the onset of the pandemic in early 2020, whereby many Southeast Asian countries put up what we call export controls on PPE and on some agricultural products, right? But then most of them were short-lived, so it lasts for a few months, and then because of, I think the wave of protection at that time came because many Southeast Asian panicked that they would not be able to acquire PPE or some foodstuff, right, from abroad. So that's why they put up export control. But that's actually, I think that's actually, if you move to right now, as the time that we're speaking, that's kind of protectionism disappear already. And I think just back to my slide on the ACRF, right, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework is kind of, and not only that ACFR that are actually initiative that coined during after the pandemic, there are many cooperative frameworks that coined by ASEAN to restore tourism, to restore other sectors, other economic sector in the region. So I don't think that the COVID-19 pandemic would break the whole ASEAN apart. But yeah, so I think if you look at the effect of the pandemic alone, I think it would make ASEAN more cooperative, because as evident by series of initiative being coined by the organization during this time. But I'm concerned, just like Professor Charney said, that I'm concerned more about the effect of the US-China rivalry on the region. Because different countries, if you look at 10 different members, ASEAN members, they differ in terms of how they approach, they differ in terms of their policy toward US and China. Right? Some countries, are closer to China. Some countries prefer to be close to the US, right? So it could create what's we call dissenting voices among ASEAN countries if they have to gather and talk about what would be the policy to the ASEAN policy, what would be the ASEAN role to play in the power rivalry game between the US and China. Right? And another factor that I think it would create a significant impact on the economic cooperation within ASEAN going forward is the Ukraine-Russian war. Although these countries are not ASEAN major trading partners or major investment partners, right? But this war actually affected ASEAN economy and in many ways. So one thing is that many agricultural products, especially fertilizer, are actually from that ASEAN are using. Many of them are from Ukraine and Russia, right? And if you think about fertilizer, it's actually fertilizer used to grow vegetable and to feed some the livestock, right? So as you can see, the disruption of the supply of fertilizer alone is actually have some spillover effect on not only agriculture but also livestock as well. And also, some of you may know that Ukraine is actually produces what we call I don't know the name, but it's actually a special gas that is used in the microchip making. So basically the microchips, the semiconductor that are used in your computer, in your iPhone, or in your refrigerator, etc. The microchip will be completely produced when when there was that, and I think that the last state of microchip production, that you have to put this microchip inside a big oven and pump in a special gas so that it will, complete the production process of the microchip, right? So that special gas is actually produced heavily by Ukraine. So as you can see, the Ukraine-Russian war disrupted the production of this specialized gas. And why does it matter? Because if you recall from my slide, I said that one way to exit from the pandemic is to capitalize on digital transformation, right? And digital transformation hinges a lot on microchip production. So if microchip production is disrupted by the Ukraine-Russia war, right? So it's going to affect ASEAN exits from the pandemic, and it's going to take toll on ASEAN initiative that try to capitalize on digitalization going forward. Okay, that would be my answer. Thank you.
Before we move on to further questions, I would like to ask Dr. Karen and Professor Charney, will it be okay if we move on forwards? Because time-wise, we're a little bit late. Do you have still time? Will it be okay? We have lots of questions, really. All right. Maybe for further questions, it will be okay to just give a short answers, 2-3 minutes, because we have really lots of questions from our participants. Just a reminder. Okay. First question. Relating to the, can you guys see the screen? Yeah. First question will be relating to the inward looking and tendency to move inland. Could it be the result of a huge gap in warfare technology between the natives and the Europeans? There will be a question for Professor Charney, I think.
Yeah, that looks like that. In terms of the huge gap in warfare technology, that really doesn't emerge until the 19th century. If we look at comparative warfare technology and what was suitable in an operational context in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, you don't see the huge gap. That's not really until we get to the new technology, steam-powered steamships, better artillery, this kind of thing in the 19th century. It's not the technological advantages that the Europeans have in the early modern period. It's organizational, the organizational advantages. And so in a lot of cases you have operating in non-Western environments, you have European armies that absorbs local technology. So the Dutch adapt very quickly in the Java War, set up light columns, and then they can beat Diponegoro and so on. The Southeast Asian armies aren't doing that in terms of their approach to knowledge and organization. So that's the advantage, not the technology. But if the larger question is inward looking and tendency to move inland, that had to do more with the nature of the decline of maritime trade during the 17th century.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Charney.
Okay, so I will address Adit's question on the Myanmar crisis, and then the Mohammed questions on EU at the same time. Then, okay. So just in brief, yeah. So just to answer Adit's question about what this bit quite difficult to resolve the Myanmar crisis. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention is that the ASEAN as an organization is operated by what we call ASEAN Way. You can just Google it for more information. The ASEAN Way, in brief, is actually a set of principles that all 10 member states abide to. For example, it's a principle of upholding national sovereignty. It's a principle of non-intervention in other countries' domestic affair. Right? So as you can see from this ASEAN Way, so ASEAN Way could prevent ASEAN from taking decisive action on crisis in some countries like Myanmar, for example. But Myanmar actually is different though, because if you look at ASEAN foreign minister statement that rolled out after the crisis, they actually they're actually different. They didn't actually take neutral stand and doing nothing, just sit still, right? So they're actually trying to play a big role in, bringing peace back to Myanmar, right? So one example is the 5-point principle that coined by ASEAN countries, right? So you can see that there's a process that ASEAN are pursuing, pushing, so that we can have resolution in Myanmar. Okay, just moving on to Mohammed. I think Mohammed has a question about EU horizon, about whether or not ASEAN could become integration would become an EU model, right? If I get his question correctly. ASEAN integration model is actually very different from EU model. So moving back to my previous point of ASEAN way, right? ASEAN cooperation also hinges on ASEAN, the thing called ASEAN way, which is a set of principles, upholding national sovereignty, non-intervention in other state affairs, right? So because of ASEAN way, ASEAN integration model could not be like EU model, right? So because EU integration model is about, setting up supranational entity to govern member state. ASEAN is not like that, right? ASEAN Secretariat, for example, ASEAN Secretariat is not, it doesn't have any power like the European Commission or EC does, right? So it's a different integration model. Okay, thank you.
Should I turn to Julius de Loyola and the anonymous question next? I can't see the others after Rama, but for the Julius's question, the age of discovery and home rule and empire and so on. Well, think about the countries mainly involved at first. Britain or England, Portugal, and Spain are already maritime involved. Netherlands are also involved very heavily in maritime trade on the western seaboard, and so that's their natural, I don't want to call it manifest destiny, but that's their natural orientation is towards maritime expansion in that direction. Russia did do that actually, but it went overland through Siberia and then from Siberia to Alaska. So Russia had that direction for its age of discovery, kind of overland procession. And don't forget, for Italy, Venice, and other Italian states, a lot of the early European visitors to Southeast Asia were not the Portuguese. They were actually Italians. A lot of the early visitors to Burma were actually people like Cesare Federici and Ludovico di Fardima. These were Italians. So you do have other countries involved in this. Holy Roman Empire was not as dependent on the sea trade. Looking on to Madagascar, Northern Australia, we see the remnant of Dayak and Bugis-themed tools. Well, the migrants to Australia passed through Southeast Asia. In terms of Madagascar, as I mentioned briefly in the presentation, about 2,000 years ago, Malay seafarers crossed the Indian Ocean and settled in Madagascar, and there they found other populations, and the population of Madagascar today is a result of the intertwining of those civilizations and peoples. And you can see certain, I don't have time to go at length, but there are certain features of Malay culture you can find in Madagascar. Now, as I mentioned, I can't go further down the screen than Rama for some reason. Are there any other questions that would be appropriate for me?
Right, from now onwards, I will select the questions for Professor Charney and Dr. Karen. Address an interesting question from Shauki
Okay,
Akbar.
maybe briefly on Rama's question on EV. I think it's that. I think what he means is the electrical vehicle, right? Okay, so whether Indonesia will become the next Middle East because Indonesia is well endowed with nickel reserves. Okay, so I don't have. I'm not specialized in EV, but maybe I can just say a quick word on this. Is that what do you mean by Indonesia become the Middle East? Are you comparing nickel as a new oil? If that's the case, then okay, Indonesia may be able to capitalize on its large reserve of nickel if it forms something like a cartel like OPEC does for oil, right? So that could, because if you can form, if you are Indonesia can work with other nickel producing nation and form a cartel like the OPEC nation did to oil, then you can, because you have, you can, pull together different producer and then have a bargaining, have more bargaining power vis-a-vis the nickel buying country, right? So I think that's my take on that. Thank you.
All right, moving on to another question. There's a question from Shauki Akbar. Maybe you can show it on the screen, Agnia. Yes. So how are your views on Chinese 9-line claim? What are the direct and indirect implications to ASEAN? Maybe Professor Charney, you can answer this question.
Well, that is a big question, and that's one of the points that may lead to political problems, because a lot of it, a lot of what's seen as loyalty, horizontal loyalty within ASEAN, is whether you support, like the Philippine case in UNCLOS, relative to China, and recognize that. On the Chinese 9-line, that's not what the Chinese are loudest now about. They've shifted to the Four Sands discourse paradigm, which is a little bit different. But in terms of Chinese claims in the South China Sea, yes, that will be, because that figures so prominently in the standoff between the U.S. and its allies in China. That will continue to be a threat to ASEAN. The Chinese receding on claiming the 9-line as much as they had is more of a pragmatic approach to maintaining good relations with ASEAN, I think, and that will continue.
So before we move on to another question for Dr. Karen, how intertwined are the economics of ASEAN and China really? And
okay. Maybe I'll just talk to follow up on just to add on to Professor Charney about South China Sea and China in Southeast Asia. South China Sea is always a flashpoint. It's always a flashpoint in the region, right? So it's you see now and then there was a vessel ramming on each other, and just kind of escalated, and sometimes it's peaceful, but it's always a flashpoint, right? And I say it's a flashpoint because in the as far as ASEAN is concerned, we have not been able to sign on to the code of conduct on South China Sea with China, right? If some of you may know that the first formal consultation on the COC, the code of conduct, was actually happened in September 2013. But now we in the year 2022, and the code of conduct there's still no code of conduct that are agreed upon by ASEAN members and China. So that's why I think the South China Sea will continue to be a flashpoint, and which could trigger or worsen a rift between China and ASEAN and among ASEAN countries. Yeah.
And just a little bit, how intertwined are really the economics of ASEAN and China nowadays with the trade? And maybe you can light up a bit on the question.
Which question by Anonymous? The second one?
It's actually my question. Yeah.
Oh, the second one. Okay. Would think it would be deeper vision of ASEAN to be even one thing.
No, that's actually my question. Just to add a little bit on the 9-line, how intertwined are really the economics of ASEAN and China nowadays with the trade and globalization?
Well, South China Sea, if I don't have the statistic, but I think it's become one of the main maritime route, between ASEAN and China, right? I think and if you globally, it's actually 1/3 of the trade is actually happening in that area. So if I recall correctly, so yeah, the economic implication of the South China Sea is huge, and by China by claiming 9-line, it was not recognized by any Southeast Asian nations, right? So, and Southeast Asian nations, some of them are actually the claimant state. They actually want, if you look at the map, they actually want to carve out some part of South China Sea as their own territory. Right? So that's why I say it would be, it would cause, it would have implication on ASEAN for sure. If COC, the code of conduct is not settled. So that's my question. Okay.
That's a really good question from Muhammad Wasil. It's just like the EU.
Single currency. Okay.
Yeah,
single currency, right? Okay. When ASEAN, we're not going to have the single currency. That's my take for now, because as I mentioned earlier, ASEAN is governed by ASEAN way, right? Single currency means that you have to give up your own currency and then maybe establish the new kind of currency like EU, or adopt another currency by another state, right? That's a supranational model, which ASEAN is not going to go that way. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Karen. And for Professor Charney. Wait, there was a question about.
There was a question about Majapahit first. And,
yeah, I was going to ask the question. Yeah.
Yeah, there's partly. I mean, there's a lot of things at work, and there's partly the theory that before the Portuguese took Malacca, that the Javanese traders dominated that sphere of the spice trade. Then the Portuguese take Malacca, and suddenly they don't control that anymore. So you have a shift in the economy in the Eastern Archipelago. There's also the fact that how do we present the break between Majapahit and Mataram, or do we see Mataram as a Muslim reiteration of what Majapahit was? The thing I would disagree with, though, is that I don't agree that, although there are always historical imaginaries, I don't agree that Majapahit controlled most of the Indonesian archipelago, most of the Southeast Asian archipelago. It was not on the scale of Srivijaya, but certainly was the powerhouse on Java. But that gets taken by Mataram. In terms of how is the Russian invasion of the Ukraine impacting Southeast Asia, especially ASEAN in its future, I think that's already been answered by my previous colleague. I'm using Karen, but I don't know how to pronounce your first name. I'm sorry. So I would otherwise call you Dr. Cal. Okay, but Karen, Dr. Karen. Yeah, I think that she has already answered that in her presentation. I think that question probably came up before she had finished that. Yeah, I'll pass the torch now.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Charney. Maybe just a question a little bit to touch up on that thing. We've been living in the most peaceful time in history, in human history, up until the Ukraine war and for a couple of years now, after the Second World War. Yep. Do you see a war in Southeast Asia as a possibility, maybe between China and Philippines, or China and Vietnam again, like in the 1979? Do you see that as a possibility in the future? For Professor Charney?
To me, well, we already have war in Southeast Asia, so and certainly Myanmar is a case in that. But if you mean interstate warfare, I think that's unlikely. I don't see interstate warfare, at least right now. There will be pressure to use, unless we're talking. Okay, we're not going to have interstate warfare that happens at a level below a larger confrontation between the U.S. and China. So if there is interstate warfare, it's because Philippines and somebody else has been dragged into the larger standoff, but the conflict between China and the U.S. and it will probably have something to do with Chinese moves against Taiwan. Sometimes we think it's going to happen, sometimes we don't think. Right now we're thinking it's probably not going to happen, but in 5 months we might think it's going to happen again. So if there's this larger context, then yes, there was a possibility of interstate warfare, but there will not be unless this larger play takes place. What is my the next one? What is your assumption on how Southeast Asian relations would look like today if it wasn't for European colonialism? I think that we would have wound up seeing ASEAN like it looks like today, generally. I think that they would have gone through the same kind of interstate warfare. Oh, okay, so this is alternative history. I can't predict everything. But we would have had states that would have, like Europe, had tensions and fought with each other, sometimes in alliance with Europe, sometimes in alliance with America or Japan or so on. They would have fought each other. They ultimately, like the rest of the globe, has found that there's many more benefits in economic interdependence than there is in interstate warfare. And we would have wound up at something like maybe the European. I mean, this is the rule across the globe, right? You have the emergence right now. It's all free trade areas. We would have had something like the EU in Southeast Asia, and that's basically where ASEAN is headed. Maybe with some limitations. I don't see an integrated state, but I do see that kind of economic interdependence. I will leave it. Yeah.
A pretty similar question for Karen, Dr. Karen. Do you think there will be a deeper integration of ASEAN today if it wasn't for the Cold War and its implication for the region?
Well, actually, I think everything is path dependent, right? I think as I mentioned in my lecture, that Cold War is actually bifurcated ASEAN. Some ASEAN adopted the Soviet style, economic model, while some ASEAN adopted US style economic model, and that's actually explain why the Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar were doing a catch up now. We call this group CLMV, right? Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And these are considered less developed ASEAN members, right? And they're less developed because they were adopted the Soviet economic model, which mean they were unable to, grow as fast as the remaining ASEAN state. So as you can see, there was as of now, ASEAN also have the initiative called Initiative for ASEAN Integration. And this is actually a capacity training program catered toward these CLMV countries so that they can catch up with the rest of ASEAN member states. Right? So as you can see, you can still see some core remnant until today. Yeah.
Right. And another question for Professor Charney. Based on the historical perspective, what major steps should Asean take to strengthen its geopolitical situation or position?
Okay, I didn't see that question on my screen. So based on the
Historical perspective.
Sorry, I can't. Okay, based on historical perspective, what major steps should ASEAN take to strengthen its geopolitical position? More engagement with the rest of the world. In another context, one of the things I've been trying to point out is that there is a feeling of confidence that the West has. It used to be about resources, but we're seeing Southeast Asia catch up in terms of resources and a need for markets and this kind of thing. But there's always been more of a confidence in Europe, stemming from the colonial period, that it has the right to engage in all kinds of conflicts far from Europe and far from the European context, to take initiatives that have nothing to do with Europe or that are, of concern with Africa or Asia or so on. You would never imagine Indonesia, for example, interfering in a squabble between Belarus and the Ukraine, or you see Singapore take up an initiative to bring peace to West Africa, or something like this. There is not that confidence among Southeast Asian countries. There has not been that confidence about Southeast Asian countries to take initiatives outside of the Southeast Asian sphere. If we want to see ASEAN strengthen its geopolitical position, it will have to develop that confidence to see itself as an equal player. And I think that some of the steps Chikawi is taking in terms of these initiatives he's taking with Latin America and Africa are very good signs of this. So, Thailand has a very small aid program to North Africa. I think that should be much larger. I mean, Thailand took some of the first steps of having an extra regional aid program, which is a really good sign. They need to see them. We should see Thailand and other countries take these initiatives not as part of, the global conglomerate of countries that are involved in the UN and other international organizations, but start to see them engage in more, at least on a par with Europe. Feel they have the thing, what to offer, the knowledge to offer, the resources to offer, and the ability and confidence to offer solutions to other parts of the world. I think that would strengthen ASEAN's position a lot more.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. I think we've pretty much answered all the questions that we have. Maybe some participants here, do you have some questions? You can ask directly here. Reza maybe, or Andy? You guys have questions? Oh, Geraldus raised his hand. Let's go ahead.
Hello, my name is Geraldus, and I have a question regarding the language. I mean, people were talking about the Malayu language, or like which derivation is today's Malaysian and Indonesian. People thought that language can be the new lingua franca for ASEAN, and my question would be do you think that it is needed, like another lingua franca other than English for ASEAN? And if it is, and do you think it's essential? Does it have any benefits?
I think multiple languages, like maybe the UN, might be the way to go. I'm not one of these people that's in favor of globalization always being worked through the English medium. And one of the negative critiques I've made about area studies is how, at least in the West, the study of Southeast Asia always has to take place in an American or Western European venue as the main quarter of that, and the language of academic discourse is in English, and and this kind of thing. With the rise of China, and it's not just China as an economic force, but I would say Chinese academic institutions and the kinds of specialists they're producing and the kind of quality that they're producing, I think we're going to see a lot more of, at least within Asia and eventually more broadly, we're going to see Chinese become a medium discourse. But within Southeast Asia, I think trying to adopt any Southeast Asian lingua franca, while it would be ideal if we could, I think adopting something that's mainly a linguistic medium in the island world may cause more resentment in the mainland, at least, than might outweigh the benefits.
Thank you very much, Professor Charney. I think we'll be moving on to closing remarks from Dr. Karen and then Professor Charney. We've come to the end of our event today. Dr. Karen, maybe you would like to start with your closing remark?
Well, my closing remark, yeah, I just want to thank again to just give special thanks to the organizer, right? The AYO Germany and the JPP. I'm sorry, hold on a second. Yeah, just want to thank the organizer for inviting me, AYO Germany and PPI Jerman, okay, to be exact. Yeah, it's a great opportunity for me to share with you about the political economy of post-colonial Southeast Asia, as well as ASEAN information development until today. So for those of you who are interested, you can just Google my name. You will find my website. It's actually karen.ac. Yeah, for my to look at my research and work. Thank you.
On behalf of the teams, I would like to thank you personally, Dr. Karen. It's been a great honor to have you here with us. And moving on to Professor Charney, maybe you would like to give your closing remark.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everybody as well. One of the things I want to make a qualitative statement, almost academic political statement, is that one of the things you may note in my talk is that I almost always cited, with the exception of Tongchai, I almost always cited or referred to white male scholars of the past. And one of the reasons for that is that this confidence I'm talking about, that Southeast Asians, academics, and others, and this is one of the reasons that Dr. Karen's talk is so refreshing, and this is something I think is going to be increasingly the rule, is that in the past, Southeast Asian scholars from the region, have usually looked at their country's histories and politics and that kind of thing and been more hesitant to speak about the region as a whole. And I think that will be that is a trend we need to push forward, that will come from this confidence I'm talking about that operates at a national level. But it's good to see Southeast Asian academics start to present with confidence about Southeast Asia as a whole, rather than just their own individual countries. And that's the trend we need to see for the future. And I'll end with that.
All right. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Charney and Dr. Karen. It's been a great honor having you guys here with us. So, to you guys, attendees, that will be our event for today. Thank you very much for participating, and maybe see you next time.